Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. I'm Ashley Dudzik. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here at Income Lab, and we're thrilled to have you today for our webinar, Panic to Poise. And I'm going to hand it right on over here to Jeff Bauer here in a second. But before I do, I just wanted to mention to all of our attendees that if you have any questions throughout the duration of the webinar, please be sure to put them in the Q&A and not the chat so we can make sure we address those at the end of the webinar. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jeff.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you all of my friends for joining today. I think we're going to have some fun with this. What we're going to look at today is really just the client's perspective in retirement planning. So this is a very stressful thing that many clients lose sleep over. Charles Schwab did a survey some couple months ago that suggested that clients' feelings about making their retirement meeting with their financial advisor sat right alongside of making a dental appointment. So it certainly is something that clients fear and concern about. And so we want to talk about ways that we can make that experience better, where we can make their understanding and retention of the material greater and their stress and their anxiety less. So let's start by looking at first, let's look at our opportunity. The baby boomers. So this is as everyone knows, a big segment. It's the pig in the python, as they say in the retirement planning, where a generation of people that were highly successful, very good savers, very good investors. Today, their ages are between 60 and 78. They represent $80 trillion of investable wealth, just unfathomable. Half of the total wealth in the country resides with these baby boomers. Would you believe if I told you that 10,000 baby boomers are turning 65 every day? Just absorb that for a moment. 10,000 baby boomers are turning 65 every day. So it's a big number and it's a big opportunity. But now let's maybe talk about the concern. Uncertainty causes anxiety more than the event itself. Daniel Crosby, psychologist and behavioral financial expert, suggests that when clients are unsure of the future, the anxiety goes up dramatically. You can see that, and I think many of you could probably relate to this. If you go to the doctor and you get a bad diagnosis and they say that you've gotten cancer and you go home with the stress and anxiety about that, versus going to the doctor and they're unsure that they're going to need to take more tests, but it seems like they may think that there's a problem. The anxiety level of the unknown goes up dramatically. And that's really a piece that I think is what we need to try to alleviate in clients' views. So let's set the stage on our conversation today. We're going to talk about wealth management, the stress or relieving of managing their wealth, the Social Security and the insecurity of that, and tax management plays a huge part in retirement planning, and it's a very misunderstood piece to the puzzle. So let's start maybe with wealth management. Well, maybe I'll start by saying we're going to do a brief overview, and then we're going to go into some details in each of these three topics. So just starting out with wealth management, how about wealth distribution planning? So we start with good old Bill Bengen back in the 70s and 80s and early 90s. He really tried to put together, a rule of thumb, a rule that kind of everyone could just benchmark to help financial advisors help their clients understand what would be an appropriate return. So we looked at, he looked at keeping things very simple, fixed returns, just a standard return, static withdrawals, and a 30-year time frame, and came up with the idea that generally speaking, you could take 4%, you could adjust it for inflation each year, and you ought to be okay if you made it to 30 years. And that's probably today a lot of advisors sort of the napkin on the back of the napkin, that is really the way that they speak to clients. But then came personal computers back in the 90s. The early 2000s, the 2000s, we came up with ways that we could look at multiple asset classes. We could look at crunching the numbers, even looking at different life expectancies and try to see maybe punch holes in the 4% rule perhaps, but also to try to find out other means that we could find ways to give some logic to this distribution planning. And then came along Monte Carlo. Now, Monte Carlo, as most of you or many of you may know, has been around for a long time. It's really the algorithm that does all the work. Now, it was really created initially with the Manhattan Project, trying to figure out how to put the bomb together. And I know NASA uses it to predict a probability of parts failing in space. And so it's been used in many different applications. Now, once it made it into retirement planning, it gives us outputs that look something like what we're looking at here, which suggests how much money we spend and what would be the probability of us succeeding in retirement. From what I've just previously spoke about, you can imagine that leaves a little bit to be desired. So let's say at an 85% probability of success, the human mind immediately goes to the inverse of that number and suggests, well, that means that there's a 15% probability that I'm going to fail. And failing is not an option in retirement planning. No one wants to visualize themselves living under a bridge, opening up a can of cat food. So that is a no-go. But what is Monte Carlo really doing? So Monte Carlo, again, is an algorithm, and it takes roughly 1,000 scenarios, and it randomly puts them out in probabilities. And generally what you're going to do is you're going to come up with something that looks like this. Now, if you were to look at this and you were to say, what is the most likely outcome, you would probably say, well, of course, that middle piece, that piece where half the people would have spent too much money and half the people would have spent enough money, that would be the most likely scenario. But its probability of success most likely in spending is 50%. Can you imagine trying to explain to a client that 50% was the most highest probability that their outcome? That would create unbelievable anxiety. I think most clients would say, why don't we get it to 100%? 100% sounds a lot better to me. And in doing that, we find probability 100% probability success would suggest that 100% of these 1,000+ scenarios would have created, we would have met our goals, and we would have had leftover dollars. So I don't know that that's really maximizing our benefit to the client, in that we're suggesting that is highly conservative. Anything north of that would really be predicted underspending. So what we're doing is we're allowing our clients to underspend in retirement. So the reality of it is clients don't really fail in retirement, they adjust. And so what I'd like to talk a little bit today is about using guardrails as a means to be able to make adjustments that are understood upfront by the client, where markets may go in the future. They can either go up, down, or sideways, and we've got them all covered. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. As it relates to Social Security, I think when I started to research this subject, I thought, oh, this is a no-brainer. Full retirement age at 67, and if you take it a little bit early at 62, you might get a little bit less, and if you take it at 70, you might get a little bit more. That's pretty easy. Well, there's a whole heck of a lot more to it than that. In fact, a married couple has over 9,000 different combinations that they could take in Social Security. It's virtually mind-boggling. Not to mention sequence of return risk. What if I take my Social Security, or when I retire and take my Social Security or not take it, and the markets don't perform favorably to me? That can be devastating to a portfolio. Looking at mortality risk versus longevity risk is largely misunderstood. And just stress testing Social Security. So we're going to look at that in just a minute as well. And then finally, tax. I will say that everything that we do affects the other. In other words, the required minimum distributions, the RMDs, affect maybe it's going to be Medicare, or maybe it's going to be our taxability on our Social Security. I guess for me, I find working at Income Lab to be fascinating. that so many CPAs have come in and visited the software, and I can just see their eyes open and maybe even their jaw dropping, where their perception of their value to clients has always been, let me minimize their tax liability in this present year, but they hadn't considered the big picture. Well, how can I minimize my taxes over the very long term of what about this client's life expectancy? So we're going to look at that in a little bit too. So let me go and let me move to show you some details on these things that we're talking about. Okay, so now I've moved us over to the Income Lab website where I'm able to do some more detailed work. Now, this is our main screen. This is really what we believe answers the main questions that clients have as they consider retirement and as they're sitting down with you in the office. First question might be, Mr. Advisor, how have we done? I have no idea what my balances are. And so the advisor can say, yes, we've been managing your money for the last 10, 15 years, and we've been able to get your retirement accounts up to 2.1 million. Oh, that's fantastic. Well, what does that leave me for my retirement? And so the answer, of course, would be, well, we've calculated using all sources of income that with your portfolio and your other sources, that your retirement paycheck looks like it would be about $14,100 a month. Oh, all right. Wow, that's direct. That's kind of the question that I came to find out. But what about if the markets don't cooperate? If the markets are volatile, what's my probability there? Well, we've already identified that as well. So we looked at your particular portfolio, and it's suggesting that if your 2.1 million were to continue to grow, and if it were to reach 2.29 million, that your monthly spending, your 14.1, we could take an increase in pay and take you to 15.2. Now, if the markets didn't cooperate and the value of your portfolio fell and it reached 1.536 million, it would then be prudent to tighten the belt and reduce our spending down to 13.4. So these are the next steps. We kind of know whether the market's either going to go up or down or sideways, that we know what our next steps are going to be. It's up front and it's in the books. So this relieves a tremendous amount of anxiety. Another way to say it is that we've got a 100% probability of success as long as you understand that there is a chance where we may need to make adjustments in the future. We're going to give you what those adjustments are. So that would be the general story here. Now, of course, client may say, well, where is this 2.1 million? Are you including my 401k in that or whatever it may be? So you can just click on that box and you can see all their investment accounts, savings accounts, any other assets that they might hold. You can even look at it from a tax perspective, what's in my tax deferred accounts, my taxable accounts, Roth accounts. It'll slice it and dice it all sorts of different ways. But if we were to try to look at these guardrails in a little bit of a deeper view here, you can click on this and you can see actually, not every client is identical and there's no real right or wrong answer here. But if you look at the very bottom here, you'll see where there's an actual range of where this household could spend. Now, our default position is in this middle position, but if we knew we had a client that was, let's say, perhaps conservative or maybe well-heeled, someone who had very little interest in making adjustments to their portfolio, maybe 13,000 would be a good starting point for someone who fit that criteria. We were to move there, you can see now, boy, this client would have to lose a considerable amount of money in the market in their portfolio in order to have a fairly nominal negative adjustment to that monthly spending pattern. So you can imagine just the more dollars we're spending each month, those guardrails are going to shift on us ever so slightly. And if we moved out perhaps over to this more extreme position, that client that said, you know what, I'm comfortable spending a few extra dollars in the early years, knowing that there's a higher chance I may need to make adjustments in the future, I'm comfortable with that. If that were the case, now a fairly 25% loss in their portfolio might trigger an $800 reduction, a little bit more severe. And on the upside, a 12% increase would get us an $1,800 increase. So truly, it's just a relationship historically of how often we might bump into those guardrails and what our comfort level is from a risk profile. Now, let's say we take this methodology maybe a client might ask a question, well, how often will I be making adjustments? Well, we don't know what the future is going to look like, but we certainly know what the past has looked like. So we can go to our retirement stress test here. Now, what this will do is it'll allow us to go back in time and retire this client during some of the more challenging periods of our financial history, like the Great Depression, the post-war decade, stagflation era, the dot-com bubble, and what we're looking at here, the global financial crisis. So you can see in this example here, this client's roughly a 66-33 stock to bond relationship, that at the 14-1 in that solid light blue area, our planned income, and then the navy blue line actually represents what their experience would have been living through this global financial crisis. I retired the client just before, so sort of a worst case scenario, and definitely a sequence of return risk in this case. So you can see on the timeline as we're moving along here, we get to February of 2009, and I hit a lower guardrail, and I'm asked to reduce my spending by $500 a month. And I have to live with that for a period of time here till I get all the way out to June of 2016, where I hit an upper guardrail and get above the line, and then sort of up and away with a recovery period of early 2020s. So we believe this is just a more kinder, more friendlier way to have an open-ended conversation with a client. Would a $500 reduction on our planned income be something that would be financially challenging for the household? And if the answer was yes, you can run up here and do different scenarios. So let's say we just said, let's just flip-flop my asset allocation to something far more conservative. How would that have played out in the global financial crisis? Well, I wouldn't have gotten quite as much income, 13.9, but then again, I wouldn't have suffered any kind of a negative adjustment throughout the crisis. So, certainly a possibility. Now, of course, the global financial crisis was an equity crisis, and I just reduced my exposure to equity. So that's sort of silly, I suppose. But maybe if we were just that conservative client that we were looking at on the previous slide that just really wanted to have a big barrier in between where they were getting and having to reduce their income, here at 13,000, you can see we have all ups and no downs, right? So a real conservative way to live through life. Frankly, that would be true with all of these black swan events across the top. So as it's compared to perhaps, the Monte Carlo simulation, the success probability, I took the liberty to take this particular household where we had this $500 drop, and I ran a traditional Monte Carlo audit on day one with a 2.1 million, and I came back with an 85% probability of success. I ran it again in the trough when the market was at its all-time low here, where in this case I was down $900,000, and I came back with a 54% probability of success. Now, can't imagine too many advisors would go out of the way to share that conversation with a client when the market is down and now it's a 50-50 shot that they're going to run out of money in retirement, which would be terrifying. Where in our methodology here, something fairly nominal like a $500 adjustment, frankly, would have been all that would have been required to get us back on track and get us moving in the right direction with increases in the not so distant future. So it's just a different methodology that gives thoughts of confidence, give thoughts of knowing what next steps are, and doesn't leave us with a probability of potentially failing that we really don't know even, frankly, what that means. Now let's take a move on over to our next topic, which is Social Security. So we'll go over to our decision lab here and look at their Social Security. Now this is where I find this to be quite interesting. So, we can either, if we know what their primary insurance amount is, of course, that can be received from Social Security Administration, or we can do the calculation, or if we know what their wages are here. But let's assume that we've got these values in here, and we run this. Now, traditional planning software is almost always going to suggest that waiting to 70 is the right choice, right? Because that's where we get the highest dollar amount. Now, the problem with that answer is that when we're building a plan, we're really needing, our first thing is to look at longevity risk, right? We certainly can't outlive our plan. That would be a tragedy. So we have to make sure that we plan for a long enough time. But as it relates specifically to Social Security, we have no longevity risk. In fact, what we really have is mortality risk. It's a risk of dying prematurely, where maybe one would buy life insurance. And that doesn't display, or that doesn't give us an answer that would really meet that criteria. So in our software, you can come up here and say, well, from a longevity setting at Income Lab, we look at longevity tables, and it's suggesting these 265-year-olds would live 96 years, which would be fair. But from a Social Security perspective, let's make that a little bit more realistic. Let's maybe say 84 years old. That might even be still a little bit high, but let's just for kicks say it's 84. And if we apply those changes, you can see now that the output shows 68 and 69 as ideal ages to get 100% of the maximum of their Social Security, looking at it more specifically from a life mortality perspective. Now, again, maybe that's a little bit high. Maybe 80, 81 might be a better choice, but I'll keep it conservative here for this illustration. Now let's think about Social Security. If you go to the website, it suggests that the Social Security Trust Fund, if it reaches a certain level, that they're going to have to make a reduction to our Social Security benefits across the board. And currently the website suggests that in 2033, that if we don't get our fiscal act in gear, that we'll need to have to reduce our Social Security by 21%. So if that was a concern of yourself or perhaps the client, they're thinking about that, they're reading articles about that possibility, you could factor that in as a stress test and say, well, if that were to be so, how would that have affected this household? Well, now we're looking at 67 and 68 as possibilities here. So let's look at the third potential option here, which would be opportunity cost. Now, everyone knows that $1 today is worth more than $1 in 8 years from now. And so, you know, everybody could understand that. So there's an opportunity cost of not receiving it. Now, if that were the case, if we were to try to put in a number here of how we would invest that money, let's say maybe in a treasury or something very conservative, maybe we'll say 3%. Again, I'm trying to be very conservative here in this illustration. When we apply those changes, now we're looking at 65-year-olds as the ideal age to take it. So again, you can do any combination of these to be able to get an idea of what that might look like. You can also see it from on a timeline here. Timeline will kind of talk to us about, you know, where those dollars are coming in, and it'll even calculate the spousal survivor benefit here. In this case, it'll show that drop here if that were to take place in 2033. And so it really helps you kind of paint a picture or illustrate how that might look in real time here on a timeline. Now, once you've looked at that, you can look at the trade-offs that one would have, what the total benefit might be. And once we've identified what we think is probably the best solution, we can then just go back in and add that or apply that to their retirement paycheck and get that adjustment. You can click here and it will create all sorts of combinations of this. I'm not going to have a sit through. There's a tremendous amount of math that goes on, but it builds out a heat map that'll help you identify what would be the best choice. But while that's running, let's move on to our third topic here, which is our tax lab. So what we do in the tax lab is we're going to take this household, and I could start again by suggesting that everything affects everything else. So you need more than a 10 key to get this right. And what we do at Income Lab is we're looking at every tax smart strategy that would be available to this household. And then we rank them from top to bottom. The way that it's displayed here is it takes what we believe to be the best option, in this case, doing a Roth conversion to the 32nd federal bracket. And we're going to compare that to what we believe to be the most common given tax advice on the street. You know, start with your taxable, then go to your deferred, and then finish with your tax-free. If you were to compare those two, that would have given this household an average savings of 10.4% per year throughout the remaining life expectancy of the client. In dollar terms, $1.1 million in total tax savings, improving their net income by the same amount, of course, and in this case, actually improving their net legacy by $728,000. So fairly significant here. Now, this this piece of the software was never really intended to be any kind of a marketing piece, but so many advisors have told me that when they consider saving our client 10.4% per year each for the rest of their life, any kind of a fee or charge that we may be charging for our services is fairly insignificant. So it really shows that taxes play an important role in holistic retirement planning. But if maybe we're not just stuck with this best answer, let's take a look at all of them by going to the tax the heat map here. So what this does is it color codes it from the darker the green, the better the option. Now, initially, I was just set this household up to take their distributions out pro rata, so they're just proportional. And for these folks, that would have given them an average tax rate of 17.56%. But let's say maybe the conversation isn't going directly to Roth conversions. Maybe it's just a matter of fine tuning their distribution strategy. And you can see in some cases here what I would have had, excuse me, some benefit. Then it moves on down through the federal brackets and the Medicare IRMA brackets. And in this particular household, this 32nd bracket sort of won the race because it's the lowest average tax rate over the remaining life expectancy of the client. Now, I think generally speaking, taxes sit pretty high in just about everybody's list, but maybe we have a client that their concern or their fear or their worry is their children. And if that were the case, well, you can certainly follow this legacy column and you can say, well, wait a minute, looks like maybe this first IRMA bracket, Medicare IRMA bracket, might be a better choice if my goal here was really for wealth transfer, try to maximize the dollars going into the tax-free dollars and going on to my heirs. Maybe I would be willing to forego a little bit from a tax perspective. So you can have all sorts of interesting conversations as it might relate to that. But one of these things about Roth conversions is, even though they're not terribly complicated, they really are. There's a lot of moving parts, a lot of time involved in doing it. And I think clients generally know of a Roth conversion, but don't really know all the blocking and tackling. So you could really help take some fear and stress out of the room by visiting that topic. And so getting back to this Roth conversion, if we wanted to look at it from a side-by-side comparison, this would be sort of like doing a Roth conversion versus deciding not to do it. You can see here in this household, it would take 3 tax years to complete the Roth conversion and then have virtual tax control, versus the other way where the RMDs are getting in the way. As they grow as time, as that divisor gets greater and greater and over time. It'll also calculate the break even. So some clients, Roth conversions aren't necessarily for everyone. You may be a little bit too old to really benefit too much from it. So you can kind of see in this case, in 2043 would be when their break even would be. And there's a table here for most clients that really need the details. We can come in and say, well, what does 2043 mean to me? So you can see in this case, they'd be 84 years old. So that's right at about what we considered perhaps their life expectancy. But the idea being, let's avoid these RMDs. Let's stay on this path and we can net out $1.1 million in total tax savings. Now, in looking at it in a little bit more detail from a client perspective, you can kind of see this on as a year picker. Now, no one really knows exactly what taxes might look like in the future, but what we know is what the tax code reads today. Our promise is that as the tax codes get updated and that information makes it to the Department of Revenue, we give ourselves 2 business days to update it in the software. So the idea being, this is going to be as updated and accurate as possible for making any kind of decisions that you might be making with your clients. But in looking at this piece here, we're looking at the present year here, where we're considering a Roth conversion. You can see it's looking at the federal brackets versus the IRMA brackets. It'll give our clients all of the details of what taxes would be, all the other ancillary taxes that might be due. From a withdrawal perspective, what's coming out of my taxable accounts, what's coming out of the deferred accounts, and then what's being deposited into those Roth accounts. As I mentioned, everything really affects everything else. So if I did a Roth conversion, I might ask myself, or my client might ask me, well, what about my Social Security? How is that going to affect the taxability of that? Well, of course, that has all to do with all their other distribution sources. And if we can keep those RMDs at 0, we could benefit from that perspective as well. Now, as it relates to visualization and in clients, I would spend most of my time with clients in LifeHub. Now, LifeHub is our version of the one-page financial plan where you can see all of your clients' assets all at once in one place. So I can see all my investment accounts. I can see my liabilities here. They've got some insurance, their taxes, their expenses, and all of their income sources. Now, it's a totally editable field, so you can click on any one of these accounts, and if there was a means to need to change the cost basis of their asset allocation or even a line of business, you can change that on the fly here, or even add a new account if they had forgotten to mention an expense or something. There's a timeline that you could advance it to any future year and see what we're projecting these values to have changed to. Little milestones about, in this case, Diane's getting her Social Security in 5 years here, and her mortgage is getting paid off. So it puts these little mile markers or these little milestones on this timeline for you. But let's say if we're getting back to Roth conversions, maybe we're still having this conversation. I might not show a client the details and the tables. I might just kind of show them here because this is a visualization that most clients like. In fact, there's some empirical evidence to suggest that when clients can see all of their assets all at once in one place, client satisfaction goes up and client retention goes up dramatically. So this is a real positive from a visualization from the client perspective. So here we are, considering this Roth conversion. Here we are in the present day in 2025, and let's say I'm going to do a Roth conversion this year. I just haven't done it yet. So here's my Roth conversion. If I click on it, it'll tell me how much I need to take out of each source account and the destination account for both Donald and Diane here. But being that I haven't done the Roth conversion yet, you can see all my investment accounts are still open and active, and all of my income sources are also open and active, except for these two Roth accounts that have a dotted line with a zero balance on them. I haven't done the Roth conversion yet, so they're not showing up. But if I were to take my timeline and say move it out 10 years, now I'm in 2035. Now my Roth conversions are complete. I could show a client that now all their qualified accounts have all been systematically closed out and all that money has been transferred into these two Roth accounts. And now my income is coming exclusively out of these two Roth accounts. So this becomes a tax-free distribution. Then I've just got my Social Security, and in this case, my pension and rental income to be offset by my standard deduction. So I could suggest to a client in 2035, we're looking at taking out $169,000, but our taxes on that are only going to be $2,640. So I found that when clients see taxes presented in dollars and cents, it does seem to gravitate. They seem to understand that and go, wow, that would be an incredibly low tax base to be able to enjoy on $169,000. But who knows? Maybe they're unaware of what they're presently paying in taxes. And if that were the case, you could say, well, let's assume for a moment that we elect not to do the Roth conversion. So same household, same year, same everything, no Roth conversion. Now we're still taking out our $169,000, but we're paying $27,000 in taxes, paying it the traditional route, sort of paying it as we go. So it kind of allows a client to kind of see, kind of do a compare and contrast of what if we did it, what if we didn't, and sort of the benefits there. With that, I think I might like to open it up for questions. Ashley, do we have anything in the queue?
Yes, let's see. We have a couple here in the queue right now. Bill Cooper has a question in here that says, how did you determine the percentage of success at the low point?
Great question. So if we go over here to the low point, we can go up and look at what the probabilities actually would have been for this particular household. So let's go over to conservative. That would have suggested that, going back to 1871, that would have been a 99% probability that the client's going to hit the upper guardrail and just a 1% probability of hitting the lower guardrail. So the probabilities, we leave them here. We allow those to be something that if a lot of times when clients see percentages and probabilities and risk, their eyes glaze over, and that would certainly be not what we would want to do in reducing their stress and anxiety. But some clients, certainly the engineering types, would want to know those, and certainly I think it's important for you to know as the advisor of how we come across it. So it's not an arbitrary number. Our default setting, for the record, is an 80% probability of an up and a 20% probability of hitting the lower. And then the most aggressive of the on this continuum here is a 60% probability of the up and a 40% of the down. So we never get to a coin flip, but it gets a little bit closer as we get out there. I guess the way that I would surmise this, you know, I can't imagine too many clients losing any sleep of hitting upper guardrails and getting pay increases, but where their nightmares reside is in that lower guardrail. So our range here is somewhere between a 1% probability of hitting the lower guardrail all the way out to a 40% probability on the right, with our default being a 20% probability. So I hope that answers the question.
Perfect. We have a question here from Joseph Alfonso that asks, oh, it looks like another participant had added a comment on it, but the question was around Social Security is longevity insurance. Playing with mortality assumptions, in his opinion, dilutes the value of Social Security as a hedge of living too long. Worst case scenario, or worst case, if someone dies sooner rather than later, perhaps money was left on the table, but it's not a financial catastrophe. And another participant had commented on it as well. Jeff, do you want to talk about that at all? Social Security?
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a really good point. Well, I guess, and I understand the point, and I think it's a good one. Let's look at something else real quick here. Let's say, go back to the stress test. Let's say I had a household that had $1 million of investable assets. Again, just keeping the story as simple as possible. And they decided, and they were concerned about a decision whether taking Social Security early or late would have been a good choice. Now, that's, of course, one of those decisions would be the risk of retiring into a down market, right? And so this is what's going to illustrate this. And so, you know, here's a case where I've taken a household with $1 million. I've taken one taking it early in and the one taking it late in the gold. Now it looks pretty similar here. There wouldn't be much of a change, but look at our portfolio values. So we started with $1 million, and now on the one that took it early would still have a value of over $1 million, where the one that took it late would have dropped his portfolio balance down to $741,000. This truly doesn't get much better. Excuse me. And of course, if we had a client that had fewer assets and Social Security represented a higher percentage of their overall monthly distribution, that could be even more devastating. So I would say that would probably be my answer is, even though certainly they could live to 104, it would be a tragedy if they waited to 70 and died at 69. So you can see, I guess, both sides of the coin on that. But as it relates to portfolio balances and sequence of return risk, I think that it's also another piece to strongly consider.
And I'm actually going to drop here in the chat. Justin Fitzpatrick, president of Income Lab, had put out some research last year on kitces.com actually about risk and retirement. I'm just dropping the link right now in the chat for those that are interested in taking a look at that. But that gets more into mortality risk and longevity risk as well. So there's that.
Thank you.
Perfect. All right. Are there any other questions that anyone has? I'll give everyone another minute or so to submit those if there are any. And while we're waiting to see if there's any more questions that are being submitted, I did want to pull up, and I was just thinking about this, Jeff, as you were talking about some recent research that Derek Tharp had put out around historical market visualizations. So I have his link to his research as well as the webinar that he had done with us back in April for those that are interested. And essentially what he's talking about in that research is around kind of what Jeff was talking about in the presentation as well, is around just clients being able to visualize what their plans truly look like, and they're fully able to understand those, how they'll work and what, and if the markets go up or down and how that will impact their plan. They fully understand what it all entails. They fully understand the repercussions of different decisions. Then they're more apt to feel a little bit more calm, knowing what that visualization of how that plan will play out over time. And so what he talks about in that research, which I really loved, was how he talked about, when people can understand and they can visualize their plan, they tend to believe it. And that really stuck with me and resonated that, not only are we working with, creating plans for people, but we're helping them. This is their life. This is their retirement. This is one of the largest, biggest decisions of their life they're making. And how do we help them truly live it the best they can? So I threw that in the chat here if you're interested in checking out either of those as well. All right, I don't see any other questions coming in, Jeff. But I don't know if there's anything you wanted to share to wrap up for today. And I'll also throw in the chat if there's anyone on the call today that hasn't seen a full demo of Income Lab or wants to learn a little bit more. I'm going to throw a link in the chat for those to schedule a one-on-one demo. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Jeff, to wrap up.
Yeah, I appreciate all of that. I would say in a survey, I'd love to hear some more of your questions. I think those are really powerful, and it's always good to think. Maybe even ideas of other presentations that we might do. And so I will be anxious to see that. And I would also say I would just double down if anybody is interested in seeing a one-on-one demo deeper into the software. I would be happy to take you through that as well. And with that. Say